Well, everyone out here has a story to tell apart from research. It was not easy to come all the way to Haifa. So that makes this particular conference, international conference, very special. Second thing is, what I feel as a 53-year-old young man or old man or middle-aged man, I feel technology is a dual-edged sword, And instead of the PowerPoint stopping me, I'll stop the PowerPoint. The PowerPoint is out there. It's in public domain. And anyone, everyone is welcome to have access to it. So instead of stopping and seeing there and letting you know what's going on, and moreover, stick clear to the timings which I have or allotted to me, I'll stick to my presentation verbatim. And of course, I'll be here for next 3 days. And you're most welcome to discuss things, have your questions addressed, and so on. So good morning, distinguished chair and esteemed fellow scholars. It is a privilege to present my paper titled Contemporary Antisemitism, Global Discourses, Political Dynamics and Emerging Challenges, Exploring Identity, Technology, Education, and Society in 21st Century. This study examines contemporary antisemitism as a global and evolving phenomenon, where antisemitism is often viewed primarily through the lens of history and the Holocaust. I argue that it should be understood as a recurring and adaptive social mechanism that re-emerges under specific political, social, and technological conditions. The paper seeks to answer a fundamental question: why does antisemitism continue to recur across different societies despite extensive educational initiatives, legal protections, democratic institutions, and decades of Holocaust remembrance? Antisemitism remains one of the most enduring forms of prejudice in human history. However, contemporary manifestations differ significantly from those of earlier periods. Today, anti-Semitic narratives circulate through political populism, digital platforms, conspiracy theories, identity conflicts, and geopolitical crisis. Social media has fundamentally altered the speed, reach, and visibility of such narratives, allowing ideas once confined to fringe spaces to travel rapidly across borders. The central argument of this study is that antisemitism is not merely a historical residue, rather it functions as a recurring social mechanism that becomes activated during the periods of uncertainty, crisis, identity, anxiety, and social polarization. Although the scholarship on antisemitism is extensive, important gaps remain. Historical studies provide rich accounts of origins and evolution, but often pay limited attention to digital transformations. Conversely, research on online hate, social media, and misinformation frequently lacks historical depth and theoretical integration. As a result, we still lack a comprehensive framework capable of explaining why antisemitism repeatedly resurfaces, how it adapts across political systems and societies, and how technology shapes its contemporary evolution, as well as institutions can effectively interrupt its recurrence. This gap provides the foundation for the present study. The principal contribution of this paper is the development of what I call the recursive activation model of contemporary antisemitism. The model proposes that antisemitism follows a cyclical rather than a linear pattern. The cycle begins with a structural crisis, economic instability, political uncertainty, identity, anxiety, or geopolitical conflict. These conditions create opportunities for symbolic scapegoating, where complex social problems are attributed to identifiable groups, political actors, traditional media, social media platforms, and algorithms then amplify these narratives. This amplification produces social outcomes including discrimination, exclusion, harassment, identity concealment, and in some cases, violence. Most importantly, these outcomes reinforce crisis narratives and generate feedback loops that enable future reactivation. The key theoretical claim of this paper is, therefore, simple. anti-Semitism survives not because it remains permanently visible, but because it is repeatedly reactivated. This model helps explain why similar patterns emerge across different regions despite major cultural, political, and historical differences. The study addresses three research questions. How do contemporary forms of anti-Semitism intersect with political populism, identity politics, and post-colonial and critical frameworks across different global contexts? Secondly, in what ways do education systems, social media platforms, and emerging artificial intelligence technologies function simultaneously as vectors for anti-Semitic narratives and as sites of resistance, critical pedagogy, and advocacy? And thirdly, how have Jewish communities and allied institutions responded to these shifting dynamics through practices of resilience, accountability, and intercommunal solidarity? And what implications do these responses hold for policy and human rights interventions? Methodologically, the study adopts an interdisciplinary qualitative dominant design, combining historical analysis, comparative regional case studies, media analysis, policy review, and selected quantitative indicators. The objective is not merely to document incidents, but to identify recurring mechanisms operating across different contexts. Before turning to the conceptual framework, it is important, or it is useful to briefly highlight the objectives of the study. The research seeks to conceptualize contemporary anti-Semitism as a recurring social mechanism, examine its relationship with populism and identity politics, analyze the role of digital media and artificial intelligence, evaluate educational and institutional responses, and develop an interdisciplinary framework capable of integrating historical, political, technological, and ethical dimensions. A key conceptual point must be emphasized here. Contemporary anti-Semitism extends beyond hostility directed at individual Jews. It frequently operates through narratives that construct Jews as collective actors, attribute disproportionate influence or power, convert complex social problems into personalized blame, and reappear across diverse ideological settings. The significance of this framework is that it focuses on adaptation rather than continuity alone. The language may change, the political context may change, the technological medium may change, yet the underlying mechanisms remain remarkably persistent. The first case study, actually there are many case studies, I'll just take two here. The first case study examines the Hungarian campaign, or Hungarian government's campaign against George Soros. Although explicit anti-Semitic language was often absent, the campaign relied on narratives associated with long-standing anti-Semitic stereotypes concerning hidden influence, external manipulation, and threats to national sovereignty. The significance of this case lies in demonstrating how anti-Semitic tropes can be repackaged within contemporary populist discourse without necessarily appearing in overt form. Political case study 2, the Charlottesville rally in United States, Virginia, provides a contrasting example. Unlike in Hungary, anti-Semitic rhetoric appeared openly through slogans and conspiracy narratives. Yet despite these differences, both cases reveal the same underlying process. Political polarization creates favorable conditions for symbolic scapegoating. This finding directly supports the recursive activation model. Quantitative indicators reinforce these observations. For example, recent European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights surveys report that approximately 90% of respondents encountered anti-Semitism online, while significant proportions reported concealing their Jewish identity because of security concerns. Additional studies by ADL and UNESCO indicate substantial increases in online anti-Semitic content, Holocaust denial, and distortion within digital environments. The central takeaway is that digital spaces have become key arenas of production and circulation of anti-Semitic discourse. Technology functions as an accelerator rather than an originator of prejudice. Technology does not create anti-Semitism. However, it fundamentally transforms its scale, speed, visibility, and transnational reach. The examples of X, Telegram, and AI-generated outputs demonstrate how algorithmic amplification, virality, weak moderation, and bias training data can facilitate the spread of harmful narratives. The challenge, therefore, extends beyond content moderation. It concerns platform governance, algorithmic accountability, digital literacy, and ethical AI development. At the same time, generative artificial intelligence introduces new challenges, including synthetic propaganda, deep fakes, misinformation, and the potential distortion of Holocaust memory. These developments demonstrate that contemporary anti-Semitism increasingly operates within transnational digital ecosystems rather than solely within national political environments. The renewed escalation of conflict in the Middle East provides a contemporary illustration of recursive activation of anti-Semitic narratives. In many contexts, public debate increasingly collapses distinctions between Jewish identity, Zionism, and actions of the Israeli state, with the result that Jewish communities around the world are frequently positioned as symbolic proxies for broader geopolitical grievances. This dynamic demonstrates how periods of geopolitical conflict can reactivate pre-existing mechanisms of symbolic blame, collective attribution, and identity polarization. More broadly, it illustrates how contemporary anti-Semitism becomes embedded within wider struggle over identity, belonging, nationalism, political legitimacy, and competing narratives of victimhood extending beyond specific political disputes into broader societal and ideological conflicts. Education remains one of the most effective tools for prevention. However, remembrance alone is insufficient. Historical memory must be linked to contemporary manifestations of anti-Semitism if education is to remain socially relevant. Films, survivor testimonies, literature, and Holocaust education continue to play an important role. The challenge is to ensure that memory becomes a resource for critical vigilance rather than merely a ritual commemoration. Before moving to the comparative regional analysis, it is important to consider the role of universities and civil society briefly. Across many countries, university campuses have become sites of intense debate concerning identity, nationalism, conflict, and human rights. Studies report heightened perceptions of insecurity among some Jewish students, while parallel increases in anti-Muslim and anti-Arab prejudice highlight the interconnected nature of identity-based hostility. These developments reinforce the importance of digital literacy, critical pedagogy, intercommunal dialogue, institutional accountability, and democratic resilience. The comparative analysis reveals what I describe as patterns without uniformity. Europe exhibits crisis-driven incident spikes. North America is characterized by campus and online polarization. Middle East reflects conflict-driven political narratives, and South Asia increasingly experiences imported digital conspiracies. Yet despite these differences, common mechanisms recur across all regions. Identity anxiety, symbolic blame, crisis activation, and digital amplification. Their presence is one of the most important empirical findings of the study. The persistence of these mechanisms across diverse contexts therefore strongly supports the recursive activation model. The study also highlights resilience. Jewish communities and allied institutions have responded through education, advocacy, security initiatives, digital monitoring, Holocaust remembrance programs, interfaith dialogue, and coalition building. The evidence suggests that resilience emerges through strong institutions, community organization, educational engagement, interfaith cooperation, and institutional accountability. At this stage, let me return directly to the three research questions that guided this study. Firstly, regarding research question 1, how does anti-Semitism intersect with populism, identity politics, and broader political narratives? The evidence from Hungary and Charlottesville and comparative regional analysis demonstrates that anti-Semitism functions as a recurring mechanism of symbolic scapegoating activated during the periods of political uncertainty, identity anxiety, social polarization, and geopolitical conflict. Although its forms vary across contexts, the underlying logic remains remarkably consistent. Secondly, regarding question 2, research question 2, how do technology and education simultaneously function as vectors and sites of resistance? The findings show that social media platforms and AI systems amplify anti-Semitic narratives through algorithmic visibility, misinformation, and virality. At the same time, Holocaust education, digital literacy, critical pedagogy, and counter-speech initiatives provide important mechanisms of prevention, awareness, and resistance. The findings also suggest that universities, civil society organizations, and emerging AI governance frameworks will become increasingly important arenas in which these challenges are negotiated and addressed. Finally, coming to research question 3, how do communities build resilience? Jewish communities, advocacy organizations, educational institutions, and interfaith networks have demonstrated resilience through monitoring, education, coalition building, community engagement, and digital advocacy. These responses highlight the importance of institutional accountability, democratic norms, and intercommunal solidarity. Taken together, these findings support the central argument of the paper that anti-Semitism persists not because it remains static, but because it continually adapts to changing political, technological, and social environments. Let me conclude with 3 broader implications. Firstly, anti-Semitism should be understood as a recurring social mechanism rather than a fixed ideology. Secondly, effective responses require integrated approaches that combine democratic resilience, responsible AI governance, digital literacy, education, community engagement, and institutional accountability. Thirdly, the recursive activation model offers broader analytical value for understanding other forms of identity-based prejudices and political scapegoating. And the final takeaway of this paper is that the challenge is not simply remembering the past, it is recognizing how old prejudices continually adapt to new political crises, technological systems, and social realities. Thank you very much for your kind attention and time.